All right, Alex, you ready?
Oh, yeah, totally. Sorry, I wasn't doing anything particularly special here outside of the fact that we were going to talk about some coilovers. Now, you've had the Racelands, okay? You've had the no-nay eBay coilovers, and you're done with it. Objectively, those aren't good, and they preyed on the hope that you never use coilovers for what they're actually meant for, which is hard driving with dynamic feedback. But where do you start? Why is there such a mess in the coilover world? What is the difference between these two things? Now, I'm Alex, Alex.Martini, with 2 underscores on Instagram, and today we're talking about the truth behind buying proper coilovers for your build and all of the mess that goes into deciding if you're gonna buy the right one. Welcome to, we don't have a series name for this video yet, so help us make one. So these are Macpherson coilovers, and it's probably the most important part of your car's suspension, unless you like driving a pogo stick, okay? At the bottom, you've got the lower mount. This is what actually like bolts to your car. It kind of comes in some fancy colors, and once you install it, you instantly feel like you actually did something to your car. Above all of that, you'll find some hardware that keeps everything from rattling apart, including a lower mounting locking collar, and then a spring perch right here, right? And sometimes there's a little washer in between that to kind of help keep the spring from being all loosey-goosey, all right? Then you've got the actual shock itself. Now this one is hiding underneath a dust boot, but this one you can see a little bit in here. It's also called a shock cartridge, okay? Basically a metal-filled tube with oil and damping magic that we will get into. And sitting on top of that, you typically would have a bump stop. That's this thing right here. It stops the shock from slamming into itself when you hit a pothole disguised as a minor road imperfection, okay? Now, when it comes to the spring, which actually supports your car's weight, surrounding it, you usually have a dust boot. This one doesn't have one. For sakes of the example, let's go back to the Fortunato one. This one does have a dust boot, okay? You got a top hat washer, you got some goodies up here, which itself kind of bolts up to your car's chassis. And then to wrap it all up, you've got another set of a top hat washer, sometimes a nut. You've got this little thing up here to adjust to make your rebound either more comfortable or more stiff. And boom, you have the elements of a Macpherson full-bodied coilover. Boom! The first thing to understand with coilovers is that every part I just mentioned, excluding the different versions that are made for like external reservoir setups and separate spring setups like the rear of a 350Z, is that every single one of the parts I just mentioned has varying levels of quality. We get asked all the time, why are some coilovers just so cheap? No, it's not just because they're direct to consumer. It's because the lower mount is made of a lower quality metal, or it doesn't feature a dust boot, or even worse, the damper knob isn't actually connected to any internal damper of the shock. Stop making so much noise. I'm trying to talk. I'm gonna lose that. More often than not, the cheaper the coilover, the more corners that they cut on things like fitment, oil, spring quality, valving, or even QA. Even down to some cheaper options, not having a bump stop, so if you slam on a pothole, you can actually blow out your suspension. And honestly, that's what companies hope you don't know. They hope you don't know the parts that are on this, they just hope that you just want a coilover. And it's like, what are you gonna do? You're gonna cut it open to make sure that it works? You're gonna make sure that it actually is connected? That's the shady part of coilovers. And just like the tire iceberg video we did, which you can watch over here, companies really prey on your ignorance of this stuff and instead use marketing dollars to convince you that they're better or cheaper than objectively better brands. So what types of coilovers are there? Before picking a brand, having a good thought process to yourself of what you are going to do with your car is very, very important. It's gonna help you stay in a budget. Coilovers have varying degrees of performance based on how you're going to use the car. That helps with the breathing exercises that you'll do with your wallet before you pull the trigger. Now, simply put, if you're on a budget and you want to keep things simple, a set of lowering springs will be the most budget and affordable and probably easiest way to lower your car. It's affordable, springs are easy to install, and depending on your spring rate, it can also improve how your car feels. Now, what is your spring rate? This crazy, silly number. Okay, spring rate is effectively a measurement in either pounds or kilograms that helps you understand how stiff they may be. Now, a 10K spring means that it would need the effective force of 10 kilograms of weight to compress it 1 millimeter. You see, most spring rates sit in that 8 to 6K spring rate for smaller cars and 10 to 12K in larger cars. It's not 10 kg, it's not 10,000 kg. K is not kilo. It's an entirely different conversation, but we're not getting into the acronyms of spring definitions. If you want to touch more, then a spring and strut upgrade will actually give you some good improvement and stay cheaper than a full body coilover swap at like $600. Those are also available at MartiniWorks, and you'll usually see Koni offer a lot of those. And you've probably heard of slip-on coilovers as well. They do exist. It's a hybrid system that uses like your stock shock. You install a threaded body, and then you get a hybrid setup. It's kind of messy, and honestly, I don't really like it. It doesn't really make me feel safe, and I've never really enjoyed it. My recommendation, either get lowering springs, strut and coil swap, or just get a full body coilover. Now, full body coilovers are where you'll see the $260 to $6,000 coilover range, and they kind of all look the same. But if you're dead set on full body coilovers, then knowing how you'll use the car is important, which goes into what coilover is worth buying. If you're autocrossing, showing, daily driving, and might play with damper adjustment, which is this up here, we'd recommend keeping your focuses to Tane, BC Racing, ST Suspension, H&R, Bilstein, or Fortune Auto. Why? Because every brand that I just mentioned has developed their own coilovers to be platform specific. And at its core, these ones typically all feature some level of independent height adjustment to preload. They use quality shocks, and they cater to a specific market. The lowest price one brand that we would recommend, and have continued to recommend even on the podcast, if you listen to that every Friday, would probably be Tane. And the most expensive would probably be our Fortune Auto line. Now, Tane is cheap because you're typically utilizing some OEM top hats in certain kits, and they typically require some finesse to install. But Tane, they've been around for a long time, and they do a good job. Fortune Auto is expensive because they fine-tune all of their coilovers in-house and are tested using a shock dyno. And to validate the performance ranges of what you get in the box before you actually install it in your car takes a bit of time. We've been there multiple times. The team is absolutely awesome, but most of the cost of this thing right here has a little bit to do with what's on it, but has a lot to do with the R&D behind it. Now, I would even argue that if you're into spirited driving, if you're into spirited drifting, if you're into even driving your car a lot of times getting a standard set of coilovers is just gonna do you just fine. You don't need to go too fancy with it. I see a lot of people over-engineer their coilover search. A standard BR series, 500 series, Bilstein B14s, or Flexi will be just fine for you. Your goal with aftermarket coilovers should be to look dope as fuck, to drive faster, to have more tire grip when the car is either hitting something or coming off of something, and you want to feel a little bit more in the pants. And these do it all. But what about this brand or this brand? That's a really good question, internet. And we're working on expanding that over on MartiniWorks.com. But 8 times out of 10, those new brands that are in a very specific niche with a very unique color and sell for like $500 or $400 are typically just rebranded silvers or BCs because 80% of the coilovers are made in Taiwan from those factories. And there's only a few brands that truly own the full supply chain of parts. So we talked a little bit about what makes a coilover, how people cheap out on it, and of course some brand names that we think you should stick around depending on what your budget actually is. But how do you tell the difference in coilovers? How do you honestly look at something like these two things and say, these are totally different things? Well, honestly, all coilovers operate on the basis of 3 things. Number 1 is your spring rate. How much weight does it take for your spring to compress? That number needs to be just right so that the spring compresses at the right time, at the right amount of energy, and for the right amount of load of whatever it is that you're driving on. The spring's weight, material, and stiffness all play a role in your spring's performance because these two springs were not made the same. Why Swiss springs have become so common and popular is because they're an optional upgrade for most BCs and Fortune Autos and are likely the reason you'll not only love your coilovers, but why you'll think you're a faster driver. 30-second Swiss spring explanation because this is really important. Swiss springs use a proprietary metal. It's derived from their Japanese headquarters that was based off their involvement in motorsports in the early 1990s. That metal compound and spring was then patented and turned into proprietary technology using a fancy steel they call HS5.TW. Nobody needs to know that, but what you do need to know is that these springs are lighter, have a huge amount of consistency in the spring rate, which makes their behavior predictable, and are more durable against loss of spring height over time. It's a long-winded way of saying they made something good, they patented it, they called it theirs, and they weren't open to sharing. Remember when I said 3 things make the good coilover, okay, the spring is one, okay, and your spring rates are a huge part of the feeling of your car. And if you're on the fence of getting Swiss springs upgraded on your coils at MartiniWorks.com, just do it, you won't regret it. Are we good? Now, number 2 is your valving. Shocks will vary in performance based on your valving and seal drag, which is a seal on the shock. Low seal drag has a higher performance, but it deteriorates faster, whereas a high seal drag actually is more OEM and lasts longer, but can limit performance. And the other 2 big things are the oil that's used inside this big daddy dog right here that I keep throwing around like a phallic object. That's where you hear of something like Fortunato having a digressive piston, or something like a BCBR, which is I think what this one is right here, features a linear piston. Okay, the overall build quality and metal used. That's another big thing. That's the third thing here. Things like your upper mounts being CNC milled versus stamped. All right, that makes a difference in weight. What type of radial bearings are used and more. That's different. The quality of the material is different brand by brand. Now, spring rate, valving of the shock, and quality components are what determine a coilover's value. That's why the audience can get confused as fuck, because a brand may specialize in Volkswagens, offer coilovers for everything, and then a Nissan enthusiast puts brand X and says it sucks for them, but then the Volkswagen enthusiast might say that brand X was the best brand to buy. It's so goddamn confusing, and a lot of times it's these coilover companies' fault because they want to make everything for everyone, but they don't have the R&D quite yet to know what actually makes a good coilover. Now, I'm going to make my friends mad that work at these companies, but I'm going to say it so that you know. BC Racing is and will continue to be one of the easiest brands to buy. Their spring rates are decent. They have independent ride height to spring preload adjustment, which is important. They have rebound adjustment. They come with camber top mounts on most platforms. They have a decent warranty. 9 times out of 10, if you recommend something, people, come back here, are gonna say to get BCs. And truthfully, the DS series BC Racing Coilover is the best bang for buck you can buy at MartiniWorks because it gives you everything that you would need. Even if you're a car show guy, or if you're a track show guy, all of this right here, it's perfect. It's the best bang for your buck you can possibly get. Is that gonna make other brands a little bit angry? Yes, but you wanna know what? BC's got like $1 billion in inventory, and that's just how it works, brother. You wanna pay to play, get more capital, so you're on a back order all the time. That's why BC is constantly sold. Whew.
You're doing great.
Thank you. I just gotta cool down for a minute. There. Next up, you have the H&R, the Eibach, ST suspension, and AST, and they kind of all sit in another bucket, but they seem to have more experience and knowledge in the European platforms. That's why a lot of people will say that if you have a European platform, you're gonna see more recommendations for those brands. ST is the little brother to KW, Kone mostly does shocks, H&R mostly do lowering springs, and Eibach does really everything, but they really specialize in sway bars and lowering springs. But generally speaking, if you have a Euro car and you're on a budget, BC will probably have something, but ST and some of those other brands I mentioned typically will give you a little bit more performance. Then you have Fortune Auto, more limited, more expensive than BC, but their quality care and attention to detail on their dyno shock graphs and shimming is unlike anything I've ever seen before. Their digressive piston in here is incredible, but you're paying for it. And I would only recommend Fortune Auto if 1, you're planning to race, or B, you plan to own your car for a very long time, because Fortunes will last you a long ass time. I've had them in my S2000 for like 5 years now, and these things are a behemoth. Airlift gets a special mention because they just launched coilovers, and they kind of got a little bit of flack because they're like, well, where are they made? Who makes them? Who manufactures them? BC does not manufacture these, by the way, in case you are wondering. But what makes these things really special, why am I holding it like this? These are really special because, and they're unique, because you can upgrade them with airbags for an air suspension setup, which I think is really rad. Now finally, the big dogs are KW, AST, Moton. These ones are special, okay? These are mostly for European and exotic platforms. I had a set of $10,000 Motons on my Porsche 996 Turbo back in the day, and I'm pretty sure those things could have served me dinner and did my taxes. These are the ultimate coilovers specifically designed to the 11th degree with the finest detail in mind for your car and how you drive it. But that's the thing with coilovers. The price of coilovers is about 70% determined by the quality parts that are used. And the other 30% is how well the brand did at dialing in the system for your platform, because at the end of the day, they're all the same components. Knowing how an AK spring feels on a certain valving that has a certain characteristic might be perfect for the Civic driving in LA Canyon roads, but it could be terrible for the flat straights of Road America in Wisconsin. Big brands that do a lot of R&D know this, and they adjust their coilovers accordingly. Those adjustments cost money, and that's what's gonna get passed on to you. Companies that get cheaper and cheaper and just wanna sell you the ability to lower your car and is hoping you don't care about how it feels when you hit a bump or try carving into a corner, the result is a kind of shitty, sloshy feeling, and nobody wants that. I don't want that for you because it's kind of like the worst feeling in the world. It's like putting on wet socks and not having backup socks. You know how much that sucks? You don't need to spend $4,000 on coilovers, but you don't need to spend $250 either. It's why we test everything we put on the MartiniWorks website, because we want to get you the right parts that actually work for your build, not just the garbage that makes us the most money. So if you have any questions, just ask us. And I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope it helps you understand where the value of spending money on coilovers truly comes from. Because at the end of the day, it is a little bit ambiguous, and some people are just hoping that you buy it because it fits your vehicle. And unfortunately, in the coilover world, fitment is only about half of the battle with determining what actually will work for you. So if you have questions on something, or you're looking to pick up some aftermarket coilovers for your car, be sure to mod your car with your friends, which is us, over at MartiniWorks.com. I'm Alex at Martini with 2 underscores on Instagram. I hope you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you next week. Nice. Good? Thanks, dude. I need to breathe.